I would like to begin the proceedings for today. I think most of you here are already pretty, I'm sure, familiar with the Aulia Council and its proceedings. But I think what we are hoping to institute today is something, I think, fairly unusual for any Khanqa. We are setting the stage or trying to initiate a series of lectures, an annual lecture, which will be in memory of my late uncle and great human being, Dr. Muhammad Hassan Rizvi, well known throughout India, Pakistan and the Southeast as Dr. M.H. Rizvi. Amongst the many accomplishments in his life, he was one of the pioneers of setting the stage for modern ophthalmology and ophthalmic treatments, eye disease-related treatments in the country. But what I think he was most known for was his activity as a human being, more than just a doctor who was an eye specialist. He was the pioneer of starting what we call eye camps in the country in 1957, when he returned from England after completing his postgraduate studies. And eye camps were basically a means of taking modern eye care and doing surgery to prevent blindness in people who had cataracts and had gone blind. And small, simple operations, but he took the whole thing to the field. Go to small towns and villages and set up a temporary facility, and it's amazing the kind of places that he went to. There was no part of Pakistan that he had not been to. And of course, I got involved with him at a very young stage and got to enjoy all the traveling. But the reason I bring up all this is that I think this aspect of his life is what is also primarily what Sufi traditions teach us, and that is service to humanity. And he, of course, not only did that, he was a mentor to an innumerable number of people. And I can easily say that because of his work, there are probably millions of Pakistanis, hundreds and thousands of Sri Lankans, and a few hundred Iranians and a few hundred East Africans and Nepalese who have actually benefited from the kind of work that he did, and he got people involved to do. And I find myself very grateful and thankful that I was able to follow in his footsteps a little bit and carry on some of that work in Pakistan. And it was this aspect of his life that was ingrained in us, that we have to be available for the service of human beings at any time and at any point in our lives. So this is the lecture series. Literally a very short introduction to the personality. But I do that because I think it was this aspect of service to humanity that was the foremost thing in his life. It's a great pleasure that today we start this lecture with two people who are going to be talking to us today. One of them, of course, is my little sister, Kishwar Rizvi. She is Dr. Rizvi's youngest daughter. He has 3 children. His eldest daughter lives in Pakistan. She is also an ophthalmologist. He has a son who is an artist, lives in Pakistan. And Kishwar, of course, is the one who, at that point in life when she began, was the black sheep of the family. Everybody everybody as far as our family was concerned. My grandfather, Dr. Rizvi's father, was a physician, and it was literally unheard of that anybody in the family would do anything else but study medicine. And Kishwar was the one who broke the flanks and broke away from the flanks and went into studying art and architecture. And mashallah, mashallah, has done very well. I have always been very, very proud. Today when I was asked that I should introduce Kishwar, I said, you know, the only thing that I mean, I don't know all of her, literally, I had to read up all the honorifics that have been given to her on Google today, because it really didn't matter. As far as I was concerned, she's a professor at Yale, and wow, that's it. And you know, she has a PhD from MIT, and she's this phenomenal little girl who used to literally, I used to have her in my arms at some point as a little child. She's about 11 years, 10 years younger than I am, so I was able to carry her in my arms at some point. Kishwar is the Robert Lehman Professor in the History of Art, Islamic Art and Architecture at Yale University. She is a professor in the Department of the History of Art at Yale. Her recent publications include the Transnational Mosque, Architecture and Historical Memory in the Contemporary Middle East, which I have read and is a really a fantastic book. As a result of that, she was selected as a Carnegie Foundation Scholar. Her next book is the Emotion and Subjectivity in Early Modern Muslim Empires, New Studies in Ottoman, Safavid and Mughal Art and Culture. Her early publications include a book on the Safavid dynastic shrine, and this was, I think, also an outcome of her PhD work. And of course, since those days when she was going to Iran to complete her thesis, she had been infusing this this desire in me to go to the shrine, and I eventually did because of her pushing me to go and see it, you know, and what the phenomenon was in Ardabil. She spent many months, you know, in difficulties because of the situation in Iran in those days, and to complete her work on the thesis. Then her last book is on modernism and Middle East, the architecture and politics in the 20th century. Her fieldwork is really very diverse. I was amazed to read about it. Includes research in several parts of the Middle East, including Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. I will introduce our next speaker after we let Kishwar give her talk, and this is going to be Mr. Maulana Masood, so I'll introduce him later. Kishwar?
I would just like to add my uncle's Sufi affiliation, and from my mother's side, the Sufi affiliation or nisbat has been in Fatehpur Sikri, the Salim Chishti's Dargah. And also, you know, when we were growing up, my sense was that my uncle's home, inner home, is Seven Sharif, the shrine of La Shahbaz Qalam. And you know, many times he was a hunter, and he would go out into rural Sindh, and invariably he would return through Sindh and through Seven Sharif, and we would spend the night there. And I remember many nights that we actually spent sleeping in the shrine itself. We were not allowed to stay outside anyway. So that's his Sufi affiliation, and he was also a great fan of Qazi Nurullah Shustri. We call him Shahid Salis. His shrine is in Agra, and they also, you know, they were frequent visitors there at the course every year. So that's his Sufi lineage, so to speak. Kishwar.
thank you so much, and thank you, Vidhu, wherever you are, there you are, for inviting me, and most importantly for setting up this incredible lecture series. And it's an honor for me to be here, and I wish our fathers could be here and our grandfather could be here. Not only because I think they would be so proud of what you've accomplished, but the fact that we're all here together. I think with family and with friends, and there's nothing better. So I will not get too emotional about that, but thank you. It's really lovely to be here. So I am a professor of Islamic art and architecture, and I work on the early modern Safavid period in Iran, which, for those of you less familiar, is a time when the borders of what we understand as the present state were consolidated, but more importantly and less known is when the region turned towards Shia Islam from being predominantly Sunni. And we can talk a little bit about the historical details after. But what I thought I'd do in my brief discussion is to talk about some of the works of art and architecture from this period that served two purposes. On the one hand, as a way to propagate the new faith, and which is Shia Islam, and second, to give us insight into the role of art as a way of understanding the world around us. And so today my remarks are really going to be accompanied by some old friends, works of art that I teach with and I write about, and I thought that it might be good to look at some works together. So, this first part. So there's a story in the Dalail al-Imam, the Signs of the Imamate, of Abu Ja'far Muhammad al-Tabari, who died in 923, that centers on the fourth Shia Imam, Hazrat Ali ibn Hussein Zain al-Abidin. After the death of Imam Hussein in Karbala, his young son returned to Medina, where his divine authority was challenged by his uncle, Muhammad ibn al-Hanifiyah. In order to find fair judgment, the two sides agreed to consult the Hajar al-Aswad, the black stone embedded on the side of the Kaaba, which was believed to, quote, present itself on the day of judgment with eyes and lips to bear witness. So Hazrat Zain al-Abidin repairs to Mecca, and upon arriving at the Kaaba, the uncle addressed the stone first. There was silence. Next, Zain al-Abidin said to the stone, O Hajar al-Aswad, and those of you who can read the version, can read on top, it's a beautifully clear hand. If you know that I am the proof of God, the Hujjat al-Khuda, speak to us so that my uncle renounces his claim. The stone spoke, O Muhammad ibn Ali, listen and submit to Zain al-Abidin, for he is the proof of God. The uncle listened and submitted, and the black stone fell silent, having testified to the Hazrat's imamate. And you can see the black stone right there in the corner. The encounter of Hazrat Zain al-Abidin with the black stone is the subject of a painting from the history of the Immaculate Imams, which you can see here, the Tarikh-e-Aimah Masoomin of Ibn Arab Shah Baramini from 1526, and it's today in the Russian National Library in St. Petersburg. The scene is centered on the Kaaba. On one side, the Imam is shown gesturing towards the stone, his hand raised in a manner indicating conversation or communication. And you can see the Imam on that side. On the other side of the stone stands a bearded man who is his uncle. The black stone is shown as a gaping void in the Kaaba, like an open mouth on an oracle, as if in response to the miraculous event of the stone's oral witness, its shahada. A group of men standing and kneeling on the opposite side of the page raise their hands and eyes in prayer. An image such as this does something more than simply illustrate a story or provide visual exegesis on an important episode from Shia history. By calling attention to the authority of the black stone, the image also draws attention to its own materiality. It invites the viewer to consider what the affective as well as instructive role of the work of art might be. It should be noted that the image is part of a series of such visual narrations throughout the manuscript, which illustrate stories from the lives of the Imams, and I'll talk about a few more of them. The paintings were meant to act as corollaries to the text, but also to evoke in the reader a pious response. So in early 16th century Iran, the cult of Shia Imams was patronized by the ruling Safavid elites. And you will recognize that video. With the popular hagiographies of Sufi sheikhs were centered on the spiritual and miraculous power of the chosen. Buildings, books, and objects were all called upon to bear witness to the charismatic power of the Imams and by extension their Safavid descendants. The origins of the Safavids are recorded in the biography of the founder, Sheikh Safiuddin Ardebili. Here we have a painting showing him in a state of sama. And he was himself a Sufi sheikh active at the end of the 13th century. His shrine became extremely important, as did his descendants and followers, such that indeed one of them, Ismail, who died in 1524, sacked Tabriz and declared himself the ruler of Iran in 1501. At that time, he also established Shia Islam as the religion of his kingdom and stressed the Safavids' genealogical links to the family of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the Ahl al-Bayt. The elevated status of the Prophet Muhammad's family is shown in a painting that marks an event that took place in 632, after the Prophet's final sermon. His entourage stopped at al-Qum, an oasis located between Mecca and Medina. According to Shia theologians, it was at al-Qum that Muhammad's investiture of Imam Ali, his cousin and son-in-law, took place, which was a point of great significance to a community founded in partisanship to the Imam. At the edge of the lake, the Ahl al-Bayt are gathered in the tent, a symbol of the house. At the edge of the lake, the five figures are surrounded by a fiery halo, and the men wear the taj, the headdress, that characterized the early Safavids and their followers. Now, 16th century viewers of the history of the Immaculate Imams would have drawn corollaries between the image of the Prophet Muhammad's family and the emerging dynastic ambitions of the Safavids, because in fact this red taj was something that the Safavids were recognized for. So many of the paintings that we see from this time are sort of corollaries of this period and of their militaristic look. The temporal collapse suggested by the previous image, by this image, is further repeated in another painting. So just a close-up. It's a beautiful, beautiful painting. In this other image, which is signed, by the way, by an artist, Qasim Ali, which shows Imam Hassan, the grandson of the Prophet, at the pulpit of the Great Mosque in Medina. The desert location is alluded to through the appearance of magnificent palm trees in the background, appearing as they do to be sprouting from the columns of the mosque. Hassan, like the men gathered to listen to him, wears the characteristic Safavid headgear that I mentioned earlier, and Imam Hassan is this. He is also rendered in a manner reserved for the family of the Prophet, with the veiled countenance and the fiery halo. The Imam is framed by a qibla portal, which, although meant to be in Medina, is covered with the Iranian floral and geometrical motifs that we will be familiar with. An inscription band praising the Shah, that is at this time Shah Tahmas, the son of Ismail, the founder, weaves atop the structure, and right above the figure of the Imam, the name of the Shah is highlighted in gold script. As you can see, right here, so there's the praises of the Shah going all the way, and the name of Shah Tahmas is right here. Now, interestingly enough, in this manner of epigraphy is also remarkably similar to this site, which is the the great Seljuk mosque in Isfahan that was renovated by Shah Tahmaz, and not surprisingly, in which he adds his name as well, in right above, and he is called the shadow of God over the two terrains, thus representing him as one endowed with spiritual charisma. Once again, an architectural setting is called upon to locate the event and also frame, literally in this case, the content of the painting. The epigraphy names Shah Tahmaz as the patron, while the portal itself contains the person he is being compared to, Imam Hassan. What is even more interesting is that at this time, Shah Tahmaz renovated this mosque, and it's not going to be until almost 100 years later that we are going to have the construction of the Friday mosque in Iran. Because instead, much of the patronage of Shia shrines was the top priority for the Safavids, such as that of Imam Ali Raza in Mashhad, and as well as that of his sister Fatima Suma in Qom. And the shrine of Fatima is, of course, is particularly interesting because this was patronized by the women of the Safavid family with the golden Iman that you see right here, that was endowed by, and we have the Waqf documents by the wife of Shahzad. The shrines were thus the primary spaces for perpetuating and, more importantly, teaching the population of Iran about the right Shia devotion. And so do images come into play. And so for the very first time, we start seeing images of prayer in the very classical text of the Shahnameh, which was illustrated, of course, since the 14th century. But at this time, as you can see, the king, Kekavos, is shown sitting on a sajda, on a prayer mat. But more importantly, he has the sajda or the khumre, which is of course closely with the clay of Karbala, which is so closely related and associated with Shia devotion. And it's not until the beginning of the 17th century that Shah Abbas is going to build a Friday mosque. So up until this time, much of the patronage is happening in the shrines. But because of a lot of pressure from their Ottoman counterpart, where like, what kind of Muslims are these if they don't have a Friday prayer, that we start to see the construction of the Friday prayer, but also at this time, clerics such as Majlisi and all are being instructed to write pamphlets teaching people that this is how you're supposed to pray in the Shia manner. So, although before we forget that the building of mosques and the patronage of shrines and books of religious exegesis were in keeping, of course, with the ideological agenda of the Safavid Shahs. But the works do more than simply convey a political message. This is, of course, extremely important to think about. They also, in the craftsmanship and the work itself, the beauty of the artwork, act as conduits for a more esoteric and spiritual connection. So let me close my talk with a few of these thoughts about something more that these works do. I think it's important to not historicize the works, which is why I wanted to give you the content of why much of this work exists and what role it plays, a very extremely important one as education, as provocation, but also that it has a wholly other dimension. And perhaps the lessons that we are meant to be taught are also happening on a completely different level. This, of course, is a gem also built by Shah Abbas of Sheikh Lutfullah, which is without doubt one of the most beautiful spaces, I think, a marvel of the world. And that reminds me that closer to home, and since my colleague will be speaking next, I'll start with a couplet of the medieval poet Amir Khusro Dehlavi, who famously visited Kashmir and remarked that if there is paradise on earth, it is here, if it is here, it is here. And I want to turn now to this other aspect, to the idea of beauty that also comes from the kinds of works that we're talking about. And I want to bring us back to the Safavid story.
I'm sorry, where was that
In Isfahan. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to put the, yeah.
There's Khomeini Square now.
I know.
Yeah.
It's Maidanish.
Maidan Khomeini.
Maidanish. Yes. Imam. Again. So, you know, while Amir Khusro is talking about Kashmir, he's also, of course, talking about the idea that is so prevalent throughout the Quran and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that paradise comprises of fragrant gardens and flowing streams, each of which, importantly, have a reflection on earth. Thus, as we know, the four rivers in paradise have their corollaries on the earth, including the Nile, the Euphrates, the Amudaya, and so on, just as the Sidrat al-Muntaha, the tree of eternity, has its corollary in the olive groves of the Holy Lands. The paradisal garden has, of course, inspired Muslims for over a millennium, from the Alhambra to Al-Ahlul to the Taj Mahal and Agra. But more intimately, it has also served as a place of mythologies, such as the poet Attar. And this is a beautiful painting now at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, who writes in his Conference of the Birds of the mystical journey of the group of birds in search of enlightenment. It's a classic story that I think many of you are familiar with. And this is a Timurid text that was reworked in the Safavid period. And I want to bring that up because just as the Safavids were propagating very much this new Shia ideology, it was in tandem with a very deep-rooted, their own roots were in Sufi Islam and the esoteric dimensions of that. And so there's this beautiful tension that remains throughout the 16th and 17th centuries of balancing the needs of this world and that of the next. So the garden, of course, remains in the text. And I want to include this one manuscript that I'm very interested in and pause here for you to think about. Which is about, the garden remains a site also where the imams will meet their students, where the prophecies come true, where the human is himself or herself transformed. So, and this is a text that I've been working with and on for many years, and it's the Majalis al-Ushaq, it's the Assembly of Lovers, that was painted in Safavid, Iran, and it's now at the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. And the story of the Majalis is that it centers on the subject of divine love, as manifested in the actions of humans, be they prophets, kings, or Sufi sheikhs. And it opens with Hazrat Adam, peace be upon him, God's own, in which the story of the creation and fall from grace is recounted. Upon modeling him from clay, God orders the angels to prostrate before him. And the angels' devotion towards him is captured in this painting, in which you can see them all, these beautiful creatures of fire, bowing down to him. His body occupies the center of the page, encircled by prostrating angels. It's a verdant setting, the deep green accentuating both Hazrat Adam and the angels. A purple ochre behind them, however, represents the mountains on the horizon, and the painting accentuates the difference between the angels, the flowering garden, and the primordial simplicity of the human body. Adam looks out directly at us, his eyes meeting ours. Now it's important to note that hiding in the corner, of course, right here, is Iblis, the angel who refused to bow down to Adam. So that, of course, is another longer story. And now, what does an image such as this mean? And since we are among doctors, I thought I have to throw this one in here, given the genealogy of our family back to us, that this book, this manuscript of the Majalis is actually made in Shiraz, and many of these are, which was a very important center for manuscript illustration, made mostly for the export market. As was this very important manuscript, as you can see, it's a medieval manuscript, it's the anatomy of the human body, and this is the only corollary I have found for the image of Imam Hazrat Adam. And so just to keep in mind that there are other genealogies and other stories that are also interrupting what I'm talking about. The effect of Adam's gaze captivates the viewer. Just as his eyes lock with ours, his corporeality reminds us of our own mortal vulnerability. The engagement is profound, evoking a fundamental connection between the text, the image, and the viewers such as us. The author, Ghazrugahi, describes the angel's entrance into the courtyard, and the great lines, which we saw in the previous image, framing the image, describe their seeing Hazrat Adam's face. Their hearts are filled with wonder and awe as they raise their voices in praise and bow their heads in devotion. The text and image reference the moment when Iblis, an image made of fire that you see in the corner, refused to bow to Adam, an entity made of clay. I've often thought of this image as proof of Hazrat Adam's special status, how the human Adam is exceptional. God loves him above all else, bestowing on him wisdom and enlightenment. But I see the image now quite differently, given the ways in which the earth itself has rebelled against us, how our actions have created a climate emergency that is hurting humankind towards its own extinction. I see the story of Hazrat Adam's corporeality as a reminder of our own mortality. That Adam is made of clay is a reminder that we are not in fact divine, rather made of the same substance as the earth. And it's a command for us to be more humble, but also for us to take care of that which has been entrusted to us. It's a reminder, perhaps, that gaining a place in paradise takes work, takes great care, that divinity must in fact be earned. And I think this is another point that I think Bhaijan started with, this love of nature that I think we've all grown up with. And I thought I would end there. So thank you so much.
I wondered if you could say a little bit about that and what are some of those alternative genealogies. That would be really interesting. I know it's a big question, and you know, but also really the question of the body and the representation of the body, right? Which is where you sort of move towards the last few images. And I'm curious whether Sawafi painting and also Shia/Sufi imaging of the body, right, human body, is different, let's say, from what we know of Sunni art, right? And so I'm very curious about that.
Those are also part of the genealogy of that. I think part of what we do is to educate, is to say that actually this is Islamic history as a whole. It's not just Sunni or Shia, but this is happening throughout the history of Islam. That images are being made, and the idea of the human body is one that is really interestingly abstracted. I think that's the part that's so interesting. That up until this time, most of the bodies are quite abstract. That's one thing. The other thing is that, when we think of, let me go back to this one. Oh, sorry, I want to go to this. This is the one that I wanted to talk about for a moment. Something like this. When you think about the painting, it's actually not just about a painting, but the work that is happening, it's about writing. So there are specialists, there are calligraphers who are writing. Now these are the same, you can see that the person who maybe designed the writing on the book is also the person who designed the writing on the masjid. Imagine the scale is different, right? One is so small, one is so massive. So you have many hands going into much of this work. So you have somebody who's a gilder, somebody who's doing just the faces. So each of them is also bringing different material histories and genealogies, right? So the work of textile, up here they can, all of this. You're going to also see in a carpet. So there, like I said, so there's one is the formal genealogies of images, but there's also different genealogies of craft that are really so fascinating to me, because they are pointing in different directions, but also different skills and different aesthetic choices that are being made. So that there's a lot to discuss. But the idea of the image and the human body is of course so important. I think, and needs to be discussed in more depth. Then unfortunately, up to
Because it's so the forbidden thing in art, and yet we have all this rich art.
of art, to touch them and hold them is in itself a spiritual experience. The one has to see it in all with some openness of heart.
नाज़रीन अस्सलाम वालेकुम। आज किश्वर रिजवी साहिबा ने यहाँ ओलिया काउंसिल ऑफ नॉर्थ अमेरिका में इस्लामिक आर्किटेक्ट पे एक मकाला पेश किया और इसमें इन्होंने काफ़ी डिटेल बताई
तारीख़ बीमारी या तारीख़ फ़न इस्लाम। बिल्कुल।
आप ओरिजिनली कहाँ रही हैं?
मेरी पैदाइश और मैं पाकिस्तान से हूँ, कराची में मेरी पैदाइश हुई थी और मैं वहीं पर स्कूल गई और फिर यहाँ अमेरिका आई थी यूनिवर्सिटी के लिए और यहीं पे मैं पढ़ाती भी हूँ, मकीम भी यहीं पे।
तो आप ये इन ममालिक में विज़िट किया जैसे ईरान, इराक़ और दूसरे इस्लामिक कंट्रीज़ में?
बिल्कुल बिल्कुल। तो मैंने जब अपना PhD किया था MIT से, मेरा डिसर्टेशन जो था वो ईरानी आर्किटेक्चर पे था और अतबात पे, यानी ख़ान के मसाजिद वग़ैरह इस तरह की जगहों पे है। तो मैं ईरान काफ़ी गई हूँ, उसके साथ साथ सऊदी अरेबिया अल्हम्दुलिल्लाह, और टर्की, इराक़ नहीं गई मगर सीरिया, लेबनान, ये सारे जिसे कहते हैं मिडल ईस्ट, वो उसकी मेरी रिसर्च वहीं पे ज़्यादातर है और इस्लामिक आर्किटेक्चर पे है ज़्यादातर।
तो आपका इरादा है आइंदा दिनों में और कहाँ जाना है?
अब तो फ़िलहाल तो इंशाल्लाह पाकिस्तान जाना है वापस। जी।
तो आप बहुत मुतासर हुई बहुत खूबसूरत आर्किटेक्ट्स जो हैं, इस्लामिक बिल्डिंग्स यानी बड़ी बड़ी।
बिल्कुल बिल्कुल, ये तो हर जगह होता है। अगर अपने पाकिस्तान में भी आप देख लें, लाहौर में तो काफ़ी पुरानी मुग़ल ज़माने की बिल्डिंग्स हैं, शालीमार गार्डन से लेके सो ऑन सो फॉर्थ। तो और अपने सिंध में भी सेवन शरीफ से लेके मकली, कराची में भी काफ़ी खूबसूरत जगह हैं, बाबा अब्दुल्ला शाह गाजी उनका तो बचपन से ये सारी चीज़ें देखते आता है बंदा, तो फिर ज़ाहिर शौक़ भी होता है और फिर कि अब और सीखें, तो इसीलिए मैं पढ़ती हूँ और पढ़ाती भी हूँ। दैट्स व्हाट आई टीच।
आई सी। मैं पिछले साल उम्रा करने गया तो माशाल्लाह, तो उसमें मैं जब वो मदीना मुनव्वरा, खाना काबा और उन बिल्डिंग्स को देख रहा हूँ, वहाँ पे जो है कंदाकारी, जो इतना खूबसूरत आर्ट वर्क हुआ है, और अब उसमें मेरे पास ये था कि मैं इस वक्त इबादत करूं या उनकी वीडियोस बनाऊं। तो यकीन करें मैंने अपना उम्रा अदा किया, इसी तरह नमाज के औकात में मदीना मुनव्वरा में नमाज़ें भी अदा की, लेकिन फिर अलग से जाके टाइम निकाल के मैं थोड़ी वीडियोस भी बनाई और वो फिर मैं जो है किसी वक्त मैं भी अपलोड करूँगा। स्टिल यहाँ पे आके इतना एवरीडे कहीं ना कहीं कोई काम हो रहा है और कैप्चर करो, फिर रात को उसको एडिट करो, लगाओ। तो आप जो है इराक़ जाने का इरादा है?
इराक़ तो इंशाल्लाह जाएंगे किसी दिन, ज़ियारत पे भी जाना है मुझे, मगर ऑल्सो जस्ट देखना है मुझे, क्योंकि इराक़ तो ज़ाहिर है बगदाद, जब इस्लामिक हिस्ट्री तो वहीं से स्टार्ट होती है काफ़ी तर तो वहाँ तो इंशाल्लाह हालात वहाँ बेहतर होंगे किसी दिन, तो फिर हम भी जाएंगे। मगर फ़िलहाल अगर ज़िंदगी हुई तो मुझे ईरान भी वापस जाना है, सीरिया भी इंशाल्लाह। अब बस हम सब यही दुआ करते हैं कि ये सारे मुस्लिम ममालिक वहाँ पे खुदा अमन लाए, पीस लाए, ताकि सब वहाँ पे खुश रह सकें, क्योंकि कितनी मुश्किल वक्त है सब पे गुज़र रहा है। आप देखें पैलेस्टाइन में क्या हो रहा है। तो बस यही है, हम जैसे लोग जो हैं एजुकेटर्स होते हैं और ये हमारा मिशन होता है कि अपने बच्चों को, जो हमारे स्टूडेंट्स हैं, उन्हें सिखाएं कि ये इस्लामिक हिस्ट्री है, ये हमारी कल्चर है, ताकि वो सीख सकें। क्योंकि देखें ना, मीडिया, आपको तो पता है मीडिया में क्या क्या किस तरह की स्टोरीज़ आती हैं। आप न्यूयॉर्क टाइम्स में पढ़ते हैं कि ये जहाँ जो हुआ है पैलेस्टाइन में, इसराइल में, जो वो कर रहे हैं, द वे दे फ्रेम इट।
आज आपकी बात सॉरी कट रही है, غلام رسول دہلوی صاحب جو آئے, ایک پوائنٹ میں نے ابھی ان کو بھی انٹرویو کیا کہ وہ کہہ رہے تھے کہ اللہ تعالیٰ نے کبھی بھی کہیں نہیں ہے کہ وہ ایک ہی ریلیجن دنیا میں چاہتے ہیں. وہ تو سب کو, جیسے سب ڈفرینٹ فلاورز ہیں, وہ سب کو ایک جیسا دیکھتے ہیں. وہ قرآن میں بات کرتے ہیں تو انسانوں کی بات کرتے ہیں.
بالکل
اسی طرح اگر ہم یہ چیز جانتے ہوئے ہم ایک دوسرے کی رسپیکٹ کریں اور سارے جھگڑے ہی ختم ہو جائیں.
بالکل, کاش یہ ہو سکتا, مگر پھر بھی اس سے پہلے کہ ہم دوسروں سے کہیں کہ وہ یہ کریں یا وہ کریں, ہمیں اپنے آپ کو بھی صحیح کرنا ہے, اپنی صحیح وہ صراط المستقیم پہ لگانا ہے نا, کہ تاکہ ہم بھی جو صحیح طرح سے سیکھیں, جو صحیح الفاظ ہیں ہمارے نبی کے, ہمارے قرآن میں جو ہے, اگر وہی سیکھ لیں, ایک بندہ ہی سیکھ لے, اپنے بچوں کو سکھا دے, وہ بھی کافی ہے نا.
تو اس طرح آگے سلسلہ چلتا رہے گا.
ایگزیکٹلی. اور ایجوکیٹرز ہمارا تو یہی کام ہے. اور پھر ایک بات ہے کہ میں کہنا چاہوں گی کہ اس زمانے میں اٹس آل دا مور امپورٹنٹ کہ آپ اپنی خود کی تاریخ سیکھیں, آپ اپنا کلچر سیکھیں. آپ پاکستان سے ہوں, انڈیا سے ہوں, عراق سے ہوں, سیریا سے ہوں, کہیں سے ہوں, اسلام کی کیا میننگ کیا ہے, مگر اس کی ہسٹری کیا ہے, آپ وہ سیکھیں. کیونکہ ابھی جو بتایا جا رہا ہے اٹس ناٹ ایون نیسسری دا ٹروتھ اسٹوری. تو آپ خود بندہ سوچے, خود سیکھے, بچوں کو سکھائیں, کتابوں میں بھی اور میوزک میں بھی, آرٹ میں بھی, ہر طرف سے دیکھیں, تو دیٹ ول بی دا بیسٹ تھنگ.
بہت شکریہ آپ کے وقت دینے کا.
آپ کا شکریہ. تھینک یو سو مچ. تھینک یو.